The Bechdel test, coined in 1985 by Alison Bechdel, is a means for assessing the female characters in movies. For a movie to pass the test, it must have three things. 1, 2 women, 2, who talk to each other, and 3, about something other than a man. Despite this being an incredibly low bar to step over, the test doesn't require more than 2 lines of dialogue, and the women don't need to have large roles or significant screen time. Most big-budget movies still fail. A reverse Bechdel test, where 2 men talk to each other about something other than a woman, passes nearly every time. Science fiction movies have a particularly hard time passing even the first and second requirements of the test. They tend to have no more than 1 woman in the main cast, if that, and all other women are in roles that revolve around men. Girlfriends, wives, mothers. It's rare for there to be multiple women in a scene at all. Star Wars, as the quintessential sci-fi franchise, exemplifies this. The first 3 Star Wars movies don't pass the test, and neither does the 3rd movie in the second trilogy. The very first movie featured only 3 female characters.
Objectification towards women happens more than we realize. In this scene, we see Queen Amidala, a strong, brave female character. When the creatures attack her, we see her backside scratched, and then mysteriously her shirt, sleeve, and midriff come completely off, revealing even more skin. But of course, we would think this was silly if it happened to a male character, because nearly every female character in sci-fi ends up sexualized at some point. It barely even registers anymore. This is another example of objectification towards women in Star Wars. Princess Leia is captured by Boba Fett, who forces her to wear this skimpy costume. These characters are written in completely contradictory ways. They must be strong and capable to justify their inclusion in the story, but they must also be sexy damsels once the male characters need someone to save.
The original Star Trek, first airing in the 1960s, was progressive for its time. The main cast featured a black woman in a major role, Japanese and Russian characters in the wake of World War II and the midst of the Cold War, and had a message of acceptance and discovery. Though it had issues, like an overabundance of miniskirts, for its time over 50 years ago, it was a great step forward. It's telling, then, that the most recent reboot of the franchise is even less diverse. In the 2009 Star Trek reboot movie, there are very few prominent female characters. While it's technically a Bechdel pass, as Uhura and her roommate Gayla talk about Uhura's work, it's compromised by the entire scene being a setup to Kirk seeing Uhura in her underwear. The 2013 sequel Star Trek Into Darkness does not improve on this tradition. Uhura is normally the communications specialist for the crew, but in practice she spends her time providing an emotional catalyst for her boyfriend's development and serving as a translator for conversations between men. Carol Marcus, the other most prominent woman in the movie, is introduced as a brilliant and qualified scientist, but her most notable scene is the one in which, in order to show what a womanizer Kirk is, she inexplicably strips down to her underwear and poses for the camera.
To fly.
Of course it is.
Would you please turn around?
Why?
Just turn around. It's too dangerous to try and open one of these torpedoes on the Enterprise, but there is a nearby planetoid. I can open one up there, but I will need some help. Turn around.
The devaluation of women in the movies is shown not just in their reduced roles, but in the way they're presented. The female officers are still in miniskirts and go-go boots, and now they don't even have sleeves, which means their ranks are not visually indicated. Clearly, their costumes were designed for sex appeal over sense. The movies value them more as objects to look at than as characters who exist in their world. Doctor Who is one of the longest-running sci-fi franchises around, beginning in the 1960s as an educational show with a time travel premise. It became a pop culture sensation and has endured in some form or another to this day. Over the course of its long life, it's had many creative teams and directions of varying quality, but its current iteration is leading it in a troubling direction. The newest reboot of Doctor Who has a disturbing trend of women written without agency or actual plotlines, who exist only to fulfill the Doctor's wants and needs. These women will be introduced as helpless, needy characters and then be inspired by the Doctor to acts of bravery, which generally involve dying. Stephen Moffat took over as showrunner in the 5th season of the newest version. Right off the bat, he introduced a new character, Amy Pond, whose entire life, starting when she met him as a young child, revolved around waiting for the Doctor to come back and whisk her away to adventure. Throughout her time on the show, Amy consistently has her agency and her life outside of the Doctor stripped away from her. She has her memories stolen, is trapped in a box for 1,000 years while her neglected boyfriend stands vigilant, and has secrets kept from her up to and including her own pregnancy. Though Amy starts off promising and descends over the course of the show, behind-the-scenes interviews pretty clearly demonstrate that there were issues from the start. Moffat has discussed in interviews that other auditioners were dropped for being too wee and dumpy, regardless of their acting ability. Karen Gillan, who eventually won the role, was by contrast a thin, traditionally attractive former model. Previous seasons had their own issues. They were often defined by their romantic relationships with the Doctor, or their lack thereof. Amy was not the only companion who had her choices taken away from her by the Doctor, and there were problems before Stephen Moffat had any creative control over the show. Despite science fiction's early roots in women's writing, such as Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, and continued support by women, such as those who kickstarted Star Trek fandom with conventions in the 1960s, the genre has remained exclusionary. Its popular conception as a boys' club both erases the women who have existed throughout its entire history and gives it a free pass on its misogyny and objectification. Though there are a lot of problems, there's also a lot of potential. If we address these issues now, the next generation of science fiction could be more inclusive and even welcoming to women characters and fans alike.